Hi, I'm Colonel Ken Klock, the Space-Based Delta One Commander here in Colorado Springs, Colorado.
And I'm Chief Martha Burkhead, the Senior Enlisted Leader for Space-Based Delta One.
And this is the Space Force Autocomplete interview. Question is the Space Force real? It is real. The Space Force was established in December of 2019, so yes, absolutely real. There's lots of now service members and civilians that are part of the Space Force. What does the Space Force do? So just like the Army is responsible for the land domain and the Navy for the maritime domain and the Air Force for the air domain, the Space Force is responsible for securing the nation's interests in the space domain, keeping track of all of the objects in space, conducting space operations, controlling the US government satellites in space. That's what the Space Force does.
Almost everybody either has interests or assets in space. I mean, even GPS, how you track where you're going on your phone. That's the Space Force. We control those satellites.
What does the Space Force uniform look like? Well, we have multiple different types of uniforms, just like every other military service. So right now we're wearing OCPs, very similar to the Air Force and to the Army, this pattern. But there's also dress uniforms, and so we're transitioning in the Space Force right now to a new dress uniform. Many folks wear the same Air Force uniform for their dress uniform, with a couple of extra changes, buttons and pins and things like that. But there is a new Space Force dress uniform with angled buttons. It looks awesome, but that's not fully fielded yet. What does it take to join the Space Force? Okay, it takes some intelligence, it takes a desire to lead others, to serve your country, most importantly, and we really do value a STEM background in the Space Force. That's not a requirement for all, but that of course is a very technical service, so anyone with a STEM background probably has a better chance of being qualified to serve in the Space Force.
In the Space Force, we only have 4 jobs. You can do acquisitions, space operations, cyber operations, or intel operations. So that's why it's kind of important to either have an interest or some kind of background in STEM.
What types of jobs does the Space Force have? Why don't you just ask that? You just answer that.
Why does the Space Force wear the US flag on the left? Sir, do you have any history on that?
So I was in the Army before I was in the Space Force, and I remember it was probably around 2003 when we started adding a US flag to our right sleeve, and it was a reverse US flag, again with the star pattern facing forward. And so ever since then we've been wearing US flags on military uniforms.
Why do we need the Space Force? I think we need a Space Force to have a dedicated team doing the things we just talked about. I mean, the App Space was doing it before, but I think having a service just dedicated to, no kidding, not only paying attention to everything in space, but also what the future is gonna be. Like right now, we're also focusing on things like the moon and XGEO, which is like beyond geo. So we're able to really hone our craft and do a lot of really cool things when you have a service dedicated to it.
I've got something to add on this one. So we have other nations out there that have recognized the advantages that the U.S. military in particular gains from having space capabilities. And so they've started working towards developing systems to deny us those capabilities in space. So we really need a military service, just like in every other domain, to be able to prevent them from denying our capabilities in space, and if necessary in times of war, to be able to keep the advantage in the space domain and deny our adversaries the advantages that they would want to gain from having space capabilities.
Why are the Space Force members called Guardians?
I do know when they created the Space Force, there was a campaign for collecting suggestions on what we should be called. My favorite was Trooper, but it wasn't selected. But yeah, Guardian, I think Vanguard was another one that was suggested. I know that there was a specific need to be gender neutral when we were naming what are the service members in the Space Force called. Ultimately, Guardians won out.
Does Space Force have a boot camp? We do have a boot camp. It's at Lackland, and it's led by Guardians, created by Guardians, and they develop Guardians.
So it's actually co-located with the Air Force boot camp in San Antonio, Texas.
At Lackland Air Force Base.
But the airmen and the Guardians are in separate flights and led by Air Force for the Air Force and Guardians for the Guardians. All right, where can Space Force Guardians get stationed? There's a lot of places actually Guardians can be stationed. Some of the larger bases are here in Colorado Springs, Peterson, Schriever, Cheyenne Mountain, Buckley Space Force Base, which is up near Denver. But there's also launch deltas in Florida. So Patrick Space Force Base in Florida. On the West Coast, there's Vandenberg Space Force Base. So those are the big ones that I can think of, but there are opportunities to be stationed in lots of other locations as well. The Space Force is standing up Space Force service components to every combatant command. Their headquarters sometimes are co-located with those other combatant commands, which are all over the country. Yeah, there's lots of places you could go, but I named, I think, the most likely ones off the bat. Any that I forgot?
Anywhere there's a radar or an optical system,
Yes.
There's Guardians. We're really everywhere. We're all over the globe.
Does the Space Force deploy? We do, so maybe not as much as other services and maybe not in the same ways, but the Space Force in many cases is operating from their CONUS location, their station, their home base. Because many of the systems that we operate are communicating with satellites, and we don't have to go forward for most of our missions, and so we're operating from here. But there are some capabilities that the Space Force has where you do have to go forward. You have to get in the satellite footprint of the satellite that you're communicating with to be able to do that job. So there are deployments. There are also individual deployments, just like every other service has, where an individual is needed to fill into a headquarters at a deployed forward location, and so those deployments come down as well. Again, just not as much as other services tend to have. Did Space Force replace NASA? Of course not. Totally different. NASA is really focused on human spaceflight exploration and robotic space exploration, where the Space Force is focused on the military aspect, protecting and defending capabilities, ensuring that we continue to have the advantages that we enjoy from the space domain to support the entire joint force when it comes time to conduct combat operations.
Now, we do work closely with NASA, and there are partnerships, and there are some organizations within the Space Force where you'll have a NASA personnel sitting right next to a Guardian. And so we do have a lot of partnerships with them.
In fact, NASA counts on the Space Force to do a lot of that. You were talking about all of the objects on orbit. So the Space Force actually has the network of radars and optical telescopes to keep track of all of that space debris and space objects that NASA depends on to keep the astronauts that they have on orbit safe from collisions. Okay, well that was a lot of fun. I appreciate the opportunity to try and explain a little bit about the Space Force to everyone who's tuned in. And in closing thoughts?
If you want to see part 2 of this, ask more questions. We'll be happy to answer.